The following afternoon, I drove back to the house with a folded copy of the deed in my purse and a calm I had not felt in years. The closer I got, the tighter my son's neighborhood looked. Same trimmed lawns. Same flags hanging from porches. Same people pretending not to stare when trouble rolled in. My old blue sedan pulled into the driveway just after noon. Graham came storming out before I even turned off the engine. "You've got some nerve," he snapped, marching toward me. "You shut off the damn debit card. Rosalind couldn't buy groceries." I stepped out slowly, one hand on the car door. "You still have food in the refrigerator," I said. His face reddened immediately. "You can't just abandon your family." Abandon. That word sat between us like a joke too ugly to laugh at. I looked past him toward the house. The curtains twitched upstairs. Rosalind was watching. "I didn't abandon anybody," I replied. "I left after your wife told me to die somewhere else." Graham rubbed a hand over his face like I was exhausting him. "You know how she gets." "No," I said quietly. "I know how both of you get." That landed harder than yelling would have. For a second he looked away. Then came the performance. "Mama, come on. Finn misses you." There it was again. Using that little boy like bait on a fishing hook. "Where is he?" I asked. "At school." Convenient. Graham shoved his hands into his pockets and lowered his voice. "Look, things got heated. You know I didn't mean anything." I stared at the fading bruise near his knuckles, probably from punching a wall after I closed the bank account. "You threw boiling water at me." "It slipped. It landed on me after you picked up the pot." His jaw tightened. People hate calm truth more than anger. Anger gives them something to fight. Calm makes them hear themselves. Rosalind finally opened the front door and stepped outside, arms crossed tight over her chest. "Oh good," she said loudly. The martyr came back. I looked at her for a long moment. No raised voice. No sharp reply. That seemed to bother her more. "You made your point already," she continued. "What do you want?" I reached into my purse and unfolded the paper carefully. "This house back." Graham laughed once. "Short and ugly." "You're serious?" "Very. You can't just throw us out." "I can," I said. "Legally." Neither of them spoke. I could almost see the panic starting to settle in behind their eyes. Rosalind recovered first. "You'd make your grandson homeless?" "No," I replied evenly. "His parents are responsible for where he lives." That one hit exactly where it needed to. Graham took 2 fast steps toward me. "You think you're gonna scare us with paperwork?" I held up the deed. "My name is the only one on this house. I paid every tax bill, every insurance payment, every repair. You moved in after your father died because I trusted you. You're my mother." "Yes," I said softly. "And you stopped acting like my son a long time ago." For once he had nothing ready to say. The wind moved through the trees overhead. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Normal afternoon sounds. Strange how ordinary the world stays while a family falls apart. Rosalind walked down the porch steps, heels clicking hard against the wood. "What exactly are you planning here?" I folded the deed again and slid it back into my purse. "You have 30 days to move out." Her mouth fell open. Graham actually laughed again. Except this time it sounded nervous. "You can't be serious. I already spoke with the lawyer this morning." That part wasn't entirely true yet. But I planned to before sunset. The look on their faces told me they finally understood something important. I wasn't coming back to that little room at the end of the hallway. I wasn't begging to stay. And I wasn't scared anymore. Rosalind's tone sharpened instantly. "You're doing this over one argument?" I looked down at the fresh bandage wrapped around my arm, then back at her. "No," I said. "I'm doing this over years of them." Behind the anger in Graham's face, I caught something else for the first time. Fear. Not fear for me. Fear of losing comfort. Losing the house. Losing control. Funny how quickly respect shows up when consequences finally walk through the door. Lyra dropped her gardening gloves right there in the dirt and hurried toward me like no time had passed at all. "Well, I'll be," she said, pulling me into a careful hug before noticing my arm. "Honey, what happened to you?" I instinctively tugged my sleeve lower. "Kitchen accident," I said. Her eyes lingered on me a second too long. Old women know when another woman is protecting somebody who does not deserve it. But Lyra did not push. Instead, she smiled softly and said, "Come inside after you settle in. I just baked peach pie this morning." That nearly broke me. Not the pie. The kindness. I thanked her and walked up the path to the house. The weeds brushed against my legs as I climbed the porch steps. Everything looked smaller now but honest. Nothing pretending to be better than it was. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air carried that closed-up smell of old lumber, dust, and summers trapped in the walls. I stood quietly in the middle of the living room while sunlight filtered through the faded curtains. Thatcher built most of this place himself. Not because we could afford it. Because we couldn't. Back then every dollar mattered. We spent years scraping together enough money to buy the land. He worked 6 days a week at the garage, coming home with grease under his fingernails and exhaustion in his bones. I worked nights at the hospital and slept in pieces whenever I could. Still, we kept building. One wall at a time. One paycheck at a time. There were months we ate beans 3 nights a week just to buy lumber. But we never complained. Because every nail felt like hope. I ran my hand slowly across the old doorway frame. Thatcher had carved a tiny notch there the day Graham took his first steps. Another one marked his first day of school. For years, this house held our life together. And somehow, somewhere along the way, my son forgot whose hands built it. I set my bag down and opened the windows to let fresh air inside. Dust floated through the sunlight in slow little clouds. The kitchen counters needed scrubbing. The floors needed work. But underneath all that neglect, the place still had dignity. More dignity than the house I had just left. I found an old bucket in the laundry room and started cleaning almost immediately. Not because I had to. Because doing something useful steadied me. As I wiped down the counters, memories kept finding me anyway. Graham at 8 years old, sitting on this same counter stealing cookie dough while Thatcher pretended not to notice. Graham at 16 begging to borrow the truck. Graham crying at his father's funeral so hard his shoulders shook. Sometimes grief softens people. Sometimes it leaves empty spaces that uglier things crawl into later. By late afternoon, my arm throbbed badly enough that I finally sat down. The burn looked worse now, blistered along the forearm and angry around the edges. I should have gone to a doctor sooner. But pride can make old women stubborn. And truthfully, part of me did not want anybody asking questions yet. My phone buzzed across the table. Rosalind. I stared at the screen before answering. What? She snapped immediately. No hello either. Some habits spread through marriages like mold. You embarrassed us today, she continued. Do you know the neighbors were watching? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because after everything they had done, embarrassment was still her biggest concern. You told me to die somewhere else, I said calmly. Oh my God, are you really going to keep repeating that? You said it once. That was enough. Silence. Then came the shift in her voice. Colder now. You think you can just kick us out? Graham has rights. Then he can discuss them with a lawyer. You're being manipulated by somebody. That one surprised me enough to smile. Funny how selfish people always assume strength must belong to someone else. No, I replied. I'm simply done being mistreated. You're blowing up your family over hurt feelings. I looked around the little kitchen Thatcher built with his own hands. No, I said quietly. Your husband did that the moment he raised that pot. The line went dead. I set the phone down carefully and sat there listening to the clock tick on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. Peace sounded strange after living with constant tension so long. That evening, Lyra brought over 2 slices of pie wrapped in foil, and a small jar of burned cream without asking questions. I figured you might need both, she said gently. I invited her in. We sat at the kitchen table while the sky outside turned soft and purple. She told me which neighbors had passed away, which grandkids had moved to Nashville, which church split over carpeting 5 years ago. Normal small-town talk. And for the first time in a long while I felt myself relaxing. Then Lyra glanced toward my arm. You staying a while? I looked around the room before answering. Yes, I said. And this time I meant it. I didn't know it yet, but Copper would soon become a regular visitor. At first he belonged to the neighbors. Then he began spending half his day in my yard. Eventually everyone stopped pretending he wasn't dividing his time between both homes. I never officially owned him, but Copper never seemed concerned about paperwork. The next morning, Lyra arrived with company. A woman stepped out of the passenger seat carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the same calm expression surgeons wear before difficult operations. "This is Eudora Bennett," Lyra said. "We worked together at the hospital years ago." Eudora shook my hand firmly. "Retired attorney now," she said. "But Lyra and I worked with you at the hospital years ago." I laughed despite myself. "Then you know more about my life than I do." "Not yet," Eudora replied. "But I'd like to help." That afternoon, the three of us sat around the kitchen table reviewing property records, tax statements, and old paperwork. For the first time since leaving my son's house, I felt like I wasn't facing any of this alone. By then, I had stopped calling it an accident. I told Lyra and Eudora exactly what happened in that kitchen. Neither woman interrupted. Neither woman looked surprised. "It's protection." The words settled deep. Not revenge. Protection. Funny how women my age get taught to confuse the two. Eudora stayed through supper that night. I made vegetable soup from what little I had in the pantry, while she sat at the table organizing papers into neat stacks. Watching her work reminded me of our hospital days. Eudora always had the steadiest hands in the room. Even back then, she never frightened easily. "You know what your problem was?" she asked casually while reviewing a property tax statement. "I can think of several. You kept confusing sacrifice with love. That one landed hard because it was true." I stirred the soup quietly. "When Thatcher died," she continued, "you stopped being a wife and became everybody's safety net. The trouble with being reliable is people start treating your kindness like infrastructure. They only notice it when it disappears." I looked down at the steam rising from the pot. Graham had not become cruel overnight. It happened slowly. One ignored comment at a time. One swallowed insult at a time. One compromise after another until I barely recognized my own life. Eudora glanced toward my bandaged arm. "And let me tell you something else," she said. "Children who love their mother don't watch her get burned and complain about groceries afterward." The kitchen went silent except for the bubbling soup. Because there was nothing to argue with. The next morning, we drove into town together to file the paperwork. County courthouse buildings all smell the same. Old paper, stale coffee, worn carpet, decades of bad decisions sitting in filing cabinets. Eudora handled everything calmly. No drama. No threats. Just facts. Ownership records. Financial statements. Photographs of the burn. Documentation of residency. By noon, the eviction notice was officially filed. I sat quietly on a hard wooden bench afterward while Eudora gathered the copies into her briefcase. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. Lighter. And I did. Not happy exactly, but lighter. Like setting down a box you didn't realize you've been carrying for years. On the drive back, my phone buzzed 3 times. Graham. Then Rosalind. Then Graham again. I ignored every call. If people cannot hear your pain, sometimes the only language left is consequences. That evening, Lyra came over carrying a casserole dish covered in foil. "Chicken and dumplings," she announced proudly. "Since lawyers make people hungry." Eudora laughed for the first time all day. The three of us ate at the small kitchen table while dusk settled outside the windows. For a few hours, things almost felt normal. Then headlights swept across the front curtains. A car door slammed. Eudora looked at me once. "You expecting company?" "No." Another slam. Heavy footsteps crossed the porch. Then came pounding at the front door. Not knocking. Pounding. "Graham." "Mama!" he shouted through the wood. "Open this damn door." Lyra jumped slightly in her chair. Copper the beagle started barking next door. I stayed seated. Graham hit the door again, harder this time. "I know you're in there." Eudora calmly folded her napkin and stood. "I'll handle this." "No," I said quietly, rising from my chair. "I need to." The porch boards creaked beneath my feet as I approached the door. For 1 second I saw him the way he used to be. 8 years old. Gap-toothed grin. Baseball glove tucked under his arm. Then I opened the door. And there stood the man who told me to die somewhere else. Graham looked furious, flushed red beneath the porch light. Rosalind stood behind him near the car with her arms crossed tight. You filed papers against us? He demanded immediately. I kept my voice calm. Yes. You're seriously evicting your own family? My family stopped treating me like family a long time ago. Oh, come on, Rosalind snapped from the yard. This is insane. Graham stepped closer. Finn heard us talking. He's upset. There it was again. Always Finn. Always the child carrying weight his parents should have held themselves. I looked directly at my son. Did you tell him you burned me? His mouth opened, then closed. Behind me, Eudora stepped into view holding the folder against her chest. Graham's eyes narrowed instantly. And who the hell is this? My attorney, Eudora answered before I could. The silence that followed was almost satisfying. Rosalind straightened immediately. Attorney? Seriously. Eudora's expression never changed. You've been formally notified. I strongly suggest you stop showing up unannounced and begin preparing alternative living arrangements. Graham laughed bitterly. Oh, so now my mother thinks she's rich. No, Eudora replied evenly. She finally remembered she owns the house. That one hit him square in the chest. I saw it happen. The arrogance cracked for just a second, and underneath it was panic. Real panic. Because deep down he never believed I would stand up. People grow comfortable standing on your neck when you spend years kneeling. Graham pointed at me sharply. You're letting strangers turn you against your own son. I looked at him for a long moment, then at Rosalind, then at the car sitting in my driveway like they still belonged there. No, I said softly. You turned yourselves against me all on your own. For once nobody had a comeback. I let the house sit empty for nearly 3 weeks. Not out of fear. Out of respect for myself. Some places need time to air out after cruelty leaves them behind. Eudora handled everything. The lock change. The utility confirmations. The final inspection after Graham and Rosalind cleared out. Every few days she'd call with updates while I stayed in Lark Hollow, sleeping better than I had in years. The nightmares stopped first. Then the tension in my shoulders. Then the habit of apologizing every time I entered a room. Funny what disappears when nobody's waiting to make you feel unwelcome. One cold Thursday morning, Eudora finally called and said, "You're ready to see it now." I drove into town alone. The trees along the highway were nearly bare, branches black against a gray Kentucky sky. I kept both hands steady on the wheel, my stomach tighter than I expected. Because no matter what they'd done there, that house still held my whole life inside it. When I pulled into the driveway, the place looked tired. Not damaged exactly, just drained. Like a woman who spent too long carrying people who never noticed the weight. I sat in the car for a moment before stepping out. The new keys felt strange in my hand. The old locks were gone. That mattered more than I expected. I unlocked the front door slowly and stepped inside. Silence. Real silence. No television blasting from the living room. No slammed cabinets. No tension sitting in the walls waiting for the next cruel remark. Just quiet. I walked room by room carefully. The kitchen counters were scratched. The carpet stained in places. A cabinet door hung crooked where someone had yanked it too hard. But underneath all of it I could still see my home. My curtains. My dishes. Thatcher's old toolbox still tucked beside the laundry room exactly where he left it 20 years ago. In the hallway, I stopped beside the marks carved into the doorway frame. Graham's height measurements were still there. H6. H9. H12. I touched the wood gently with my fingertips. Love leaves traces even after disappointment arrives. For one painful second, grief hit me harder than anger ever had. Not grief for the house. Grief for the son I thought I raised. A creak sounded behind me. I turned and saw Eudora standing quietly near the front door holding a cardboard box. They left a few things, she said softly. Inside the box were random leftovers. Cheap picture frames. Old mail. A broken lamp. And one small drawing folded in half. I opened it carefully. Crayon drawing. Stick figures. One tall woman holding hands with a little boy beneath a crooked yellow sun. Across the top, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Me and Grandma." My throat tightened instantly. Finn. I stared at it longer than I meant to. Because children tell the truth adults spend years trying to bury. You okay? Eudora asked gently. I nodded once, though it took effort. He didn't become them yet, I said quietly. Eudora's expression softened. No, she agreed. Not yet. I folded the drawing carefully and slipped it into my purse. Then I walked through the rest of the house one final time. The master bedroom still smelled faintly like Rosalind's perfume. Closets stood half empty. The bathroom mirror carried little streaks where somebody rushed through packing. Evidence of people forced to leave faster than they planned. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I mostly felt finished. Like a chapter finally closing. Back in the kitchen, Eudora leaned against the counter while I stood by the sink where everything had changed. The exact spot. Funny how ordinary it looked now. No sign of violence. No sign of betrayal. Just an old kitchen in Kentucky. You know, Eudora said carefully. Most people never do what you just did. I glanced at her. Why? Because guilt keeps women obedient long after love disappears. That sat with me. I looked around the room again before answering. I think I stayed too long because I kept waiting for my son to remember who he used to be. And now, I rested my hand lightly against the counter. Now I remember who I used to be. Eudora smiled at that. A real smile. Not pity. Respect. Before leaving, I opened every curtain in the house and let the afternoon light pour inside. Sunlight stretched across the floors, warm and golden, touching rooms that had felt dark for years. The place breathed differently already. As we stepped onto the porch, I locked the front door behind me. Mine. Still mine. But this time the word no longer sounded defensive. It sounded peaceful. For several months the house sat mostly empty. I repaired what needed repairing. Painted walls. Fixed cabinets. Replaced broken fixtures. The more time I spent there, the more I realized something unexpected. The house was too large for one person. And there were too many women my age carrying stories that sounded painfully familiar. The idea arrived quietly. One spare room became two. Two became four. Eudora helped with the paperwork. Lyra recruited volunteers. By the end of the year, the house had become a place where women could stay while rebuilding their lives. Not charity. Not rescue. Just a safe place to start over. One of the first women Eudora introduced me to was Coraline. She was 68, recently widowed, and had nowhere affordable to go after losing her apartment. At first, I only planned to rent her a room. Then another woman needed help. Then another. Before long, the house became something larger than I ever intended. Not a shelter exactly. A second chance. I sit on the porch most mornings now with a cup of coffee warming my hands and Copper snoring somewhere nearby in the grass. The world moves slower out here. Not lonely. Just honest. The women who come through the house in town are all different. Different ages. Different stories. Same exhaustion in their eyes when they first arrive. Some stay 2 weeks. Some stay 6 months. Most cry the first night. Not because the beds are uncomfortable. Because nobody is yelling. Coraline still lives there. She planted marigolds along the front walk last spring. Said every happy home deserves flowers. I smiled when she told me that. Thatcher used to say the same thing. Sometimes I drive into town just to drop off groceries or tighten a loose cabinet hinge. The women always insist on making coffee for me even though the place is technically mine. But that's the thing. It stopped being mine in the lonely way ownership sometimes works. Now it belongs to people who need peace. And somehow that feels better. A few months after I burned the letter, Eudora came by carrying a newspaper folded under her arm. You made page 3, she announced. I laughed. Lord help us. There was a small article about the house. Nothing dramatic. Just a local story about a retired nurse offering affordable housing to displaced senior women. No names beyond mine. No ugly details. Still word spread. Church groups started donating blankets. A hardware store owner offered discounted repairs. One retired carpenter volunteered to rebuild the back porch. Funny how kindness multiplies once somebody finally starts it. One afternoon while I was repainting the mailbox, a small sedan pulled slowly into the driveway. I recognized it immediately. Graham climbed out alone. He looked older. Not older in years. Older in consequences. For a second he just stood there beside the car. Hands shoved into his jacket pockets like a nervous teenager. I set the paintbrush down carefully. Neither of us spoke first. The wind moved softly through the trees overhead. Finally he cleared his throat. I heard about the house. I nodded once. Coraline makes better meatloaf than I ever did, I said lightly. To my surprise he gave a short laugh. Small. Broken. But real. His eyes moved toward the wooden sign near the mailbox. A safe place. The words sat between us. I deserved what happened, he said quietly. I studied his face. The anger was gone now. So was the arrogance. Life had sanded both away. I know, I replied. That hurt him more than shouting would have. He looked down at his boots for a moment before speaking again. I stopped drinking. That surprised me. Not because I hadn't suspected it. Because he finally admitted it aloud. I'm seeing Finn every weekend now, he continued. Rosalind and I are officially done. I stayed quiet. Some stories do not need commentary. He swallowed hard. I was angry all the time after Dad died. Then I just stayed angry. There it was. Not an excuse. Just truth. For the first time in years, he sounded like a man tired of lying to himself. I kept thinking you'd forgive anything because you always had before, he admitted. I looked out toward the road stretching past the property. That was my mistake too. He nodded slowly. We stood there a while without speaking. Not every silence is cruel. Some are simply honest enough to hold what words cannot. Finally Graham reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something folded. Finn's drawing. The original one. Only now there were new crayon figures added beside the old ones. A little taller. A little steadier. At the top, in messy handwriting, Finn had written, Grandma's house helps people. My throat tightened before I could stop it. Finn wanted you to have it, Graham said quietly. I took the paper carefully. He asks about you all the time. A sharp ache passed through me then. Because children keep loving people long after adults ruin things. I'd like to see him sometime, I admitted softly. Graham nodded too fast, relief flashing across his face before he tried to hide it. I'd like that too. Neither of us rushed the moment. Trust does not return all at once. It arrives slowly, like spring after a hard winter. Possible, but careful. Before leaving, Graham glanced once more at the house behind me. You really built something good here, Mom. I looked past him toward the women inside laughing over something in the kitchen. Toward the porch Thatcher built with his own hands. Toward the life I thought had ended the night I walked out carrying that deed. No, I said quietly. I rebuilt it. The porch creaks beneath me every morning like it's saying hello. Some sounds grow comforting with age. The kettle whistling. Rain on a metal roof. Tree branches brushing against the windows at night. Even silence has a gentler shape out here. The scar on my arm faded over time. It still runs from my wrist to my elbow, pale and shiny in certain light. Some mornings I trace it absent-mindedly while my coffee cools beside me. It no longer feels like pain. Just proof. Proof that I survived something I once thought would break me. A girl from down the road visits sometimes. Avelini. 17, maybe 18 now. Smart eyes. Always carrying that little notebook against her chest like she's afraid the world might steal her thoughts if she sets them down. She asks questions older people usually get ignored long before anyone thinks to ask. One chilly afternoon, she sat beside me on the porch swing and said, Mrs. Holomere, were you scared living alone after everything happened? I smiled into my coffee. No, sweetheart, I told her. Being alone and being abandoned aren't the same thing. She wrote that down immediately. Young people still think wisdom arrives loudly. Truth is, most of it comes quietly after enough hard years. A few minutes later she asked why I never moved back into the big house. I looked across the field toward the place standing warm beneath the afternoon sun. Coraline's curtains hung in the windows now. Someone had planted fresh flowers beside the porch. The house looked alive again. I already reclaimed it, I said. Avelini frowned a little. But you don't live there. I laughed softly. Honey, ownership isn't always about where you sleep. She got quiet after that. I rested my hands against the porch rail and looked out at the trees swaying slowly beyond the road. People think getting older makes women fragile, I told her. But mostly it just makes us tired of pretending. Tired how? Tired of shrinking ourselves to keep other people comfortable. That one she wrote down too. The breeze moved gently through the yard. Somewhere nearby, Copper barked once before losing interest in whatever offended him. I pointed toward the house in town. That roof over there? I said. It remembers who built it. Every board. Every nail. Places remember truth even when people don't. Avellini followed my gaze. You really loved your son, didn't you? The question sat between us quietly. I still do, I answered honestly, because that was the hardest part for people to understand. Love did not disappear. I just finally loved myself enough to. A few months ago, Finn came to visit by himself for the first time. Graham drove him over and waited in the car. The boy had grown taller already. Thin shoulders. Same dark eyes. He hugged me so hard my coffee nearly spilled. Dad says you help people now, he told me proudly. I smiled. I tried to. He wandered through the cottage asking questions about everything. Thatcher's old fishing hat hanging by the door. The wind chimes. The marigolds outside. Before leaving, he stopped beside my chair on the porch. Dad cries sometimes now, he whispered carefully. Children notice more than adults think. I looked toward the road where Graham sat waiting behind the steering wheel. He's learning, I said softly. Finn nodded like that answer made sense. Maybe it did. Healing rarely looks dramatic. Most times it's just people finally telling the truth after years of avoiding it. These days, the house across town shelters women who thought their lives were over too. One lost her home after her husband died. Another got pushed aside by children who suddenly treated her like inconvenient furniture. Different stories. Same ache. But when they walk through that front door now, they find warm food, clean sheets, and somebody who understands what silence can do to a person. That matters. More than revenge ever could. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit alone on this porch while the sky turns lavender over the hills and think about the woman I used to be. The one who stayed quiet too long. The one who thought endurance was the same thing as love. I don't judge her anymore. She survived the only way she knew how. But I'm proudest of the woman who finally stood up, picked up the deed, and walked out the front door with her dignity intact. That woman saved my life. And if somebody asks me how the story ends, I tell them the truth. My son wanted me gone. So I left. But I took the roof with me. Not because I was cruel. Because I finally remembered it belonged to me. And now I wake up every morning under a roof built by honest hands, surrounded by peace nobody can take away. I am still here. Still standing. Still building something good from what tried to destroy me. And maybe that's the real revenge after all. Not watching people fall, but refusing to fall with them.